Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner and the Apocalypse. Chapter 561 Lonely Wolf or War Cry. Chapter 561 Lonely Wolf or War Cry. Lilith and Xietain spent several minutes maintaining the same position without saying a single word. After Xietain recovered from the fierce enthusiasm that hit him when he understood the meaning that the small wooden pagoda had not only for him, but for any human, all he did was to close his eyes, while easily encircling that slender waist, that felt so smooth and flexible to the touch through the night black silk dress with his arms. He enjoyed this rare moment that had presented itself after a series of circumstances occurred at the same time. There was not the slightest trace of lust in the mind of Xietain, as he enjoyed the soft breaths of the lovely woman in his embrace, and even though he could feel every inch of her seductive body through the clothing, all he felt was relief and gratitude. It was just a hug that for many would not mean much, since in the day-to-day life, they could get as many hugs as they wanted. However, this was the first hug Xietain had received from a dear one since the apocalypse began, and for the first time he felt something similar to that blessed feeling of coming home. Lilith could feel the respect and affection being transmitted to her body through Xietan's arms, as the way he wrapped his arms around her waist was so pure and devoid of any nefarious thoughts or ulterior intentions. It felt like the embrace a lover would give his partner after a long day of work, having returned home. Even when Lilith's backside was practically within reach of his hands, and even though he knew she wouldn't complain about anything at this point, all Xietain did was move his hands tenderly down to her lower back before continuing to caress with repeated upward motions. Although they both greatly enjoyed this rare moment in which silence spoke louder than 1,000 words, the world situation did not allow them to take breaks. This was especially so for Xietain. With the second evolution of Earth just around the corner, every second counted, and Xietain had lost a lot of time when he fell into a state of deep sleep in order to allow his soul to recover from its wounds at thunderous speeds. After around 20 minutes, when Lilith felt the thumping of Xietan's excited heart calming down, she slowly brought her beautiful little face out of its hiding place to look into his eyes. Although the heart of Lilith felt a little lost when that intoxicating masculine scent that belonged only to him left her, seeing his black eyes as bright as pearls so close definitely and undoubtedly made up for it. "Hey," Xietain whispered as he lost himself in those two beautiful rubies before him. "Hey," Lilith said in the same tone of voice as him, as her eyes subconsciously watched his lips at a dangerously close distance. For a moment, the two looked at each other as if they were considering something very important. However, Lilith soon seemed to think of something, and instead of moving closer to conclude what they both expected, she leaned her body back so that her two soft cheeks rested comfortably on Xietan's abdomen. "So, let me see what that pagoda has to get you so excited." She stretched her hand forward as she looked down at him with a big smile on her face. The eyes of Xietain flashed with a hint of deception as he watched Lilith move away, but he soon dismissed that feeling of deception as well, since, while he was inexperienced with women, he was actually considerably observant. Therefore, Xietain understood the reason why Lilith did what she did. She was holding back right now as well. After all, the timing was perfect for it to happen. However, Xietain was busy and had too much work to do. Lilith believed that the true partner of such a wonderful existence as he was needed to be sensible and understanding enough to know what was best for him at times like this, since momentary desires were just that, passing desires. The simple fact of seeing Xietain devastated by the death of a relative of his as a consequence of being delayed a few seconds due to being with her was something Lilith didn't even want to think about. What was the rush? An infinite eternity awaited ahead. Xietain gently rested both hands on Lilith's thighs covered by her long black dress, and as he felt her softness he said with a teasing smile, "Nope, I won't show you." He didn't wait for a reply from her as he brought both hands to her small waist and lifted her body without hindrance before standing up himself. Lilith felt as if she was a 5-year-old girl being lifted up by Xietain like this, and while looking down at him from above with her feet off the ground, she made a pout that suited her current situation. "Hey." Xietain put her down on the ground and looked at the small wooden pagoda in his hand. The wooden pagoda did not look normal in any way despite its diminutive size. In fact, the reason why Xietain would describe it as a wooden pagoda was because the material used seemed to be wood, but honestly he wasn't even sure about it. Looking carefully, the wooden pagoda was replete with magic runes that formed strange and mysterious patterns in such a way that they connected with each other to form a large magic circle, which held the center free, as if waiting for the missing piece to arrive soon. "Why don't I show you the use of this treasure instead?" Lilith looked at Xietain in confusion as she heard his words. He looked at her with a confident smile and narrowed eyes as he slowly said, I'm sure even you, a sixth-order existence, will be amazed by what this baby in my hands can do. Oh? She raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. For Xietain to say such a thing, then it could only mean that that wooden pagoda was truly incredible. However, Lilith couldn't help but pour cold water over his head, saying, You little scoundrel, I've seen a few pagodas like the one you have. She pointed out in a neutral voice, the demonic army and all the factions of higher existences have one. The wooden pagoda was a treasure that was given by the soul record when an existence met a certain requirement, or met a certain number of criteria which were unknown. However, considering that the wooden pagoda of Lucifer was in charge of modifying Lilith's records to turn her into a succubus-like demon that suited her class, and due to small fragments of information she gathered throughout her life, anyone wishing to become a true leader had to first obtain a wooden pagoda, like the one of Xietain. While it was unlikely that all wooden pagodas were the same, Lilith was 99.99% sure that each one had different abilities, since the magic runes on Xietan's pagoda were different from the runes she saw 10 years ago on the wooden pagoda in the possession of Lucifer. However, even after he heard Lilith's words, the confident smile on the face of Xietain did not recede. On the contrary, his confidence now became more prominent, and a glint of pride flashed in his pitch-black eyes as he said, No. Believe me, you will be amazed when you see what my wooden pagoda can do, he said in a mysterious voice. Maybe not at present, but my pagoda will definitely be a lot more powerful than the demon lords in the future. Now, the curiosity of Lilith had reached its peak. Xietain had always, from the very beginning, been a confident person, and although he used to cover it up quite well, Lilith knew that in his bones, he hid arrogance as immense and vast as the skies themselves. Therefore, if he said such a thing despite having heard Lilith's words, then he must have been very confident. Otherwise he would not say something that would soon put him to shame. Xietain turned his hand over, and the small wooden pagoda was soon brought inside the space of his storage ring. He sat on the edge of the bed and closed his eyes. Lilith, give me a few minutes. I need to explore some important records I obtained during the war on the bridge, he said with his eyes closed. Okay. Lilith agreed and sat down next to him as she stared at his concentrated and serious face. Men really do look more handsome when they were earnestly working on their goals, she sighed in her heart, as Xietan's consciousness dipped deeper and deeper into his most recent records. Although the records Xietain was looking for were submerged under the records of millions of lives, this time he had much more experience compared to the past, and since he also had a clue, it didn't take him more than a couple of seconds to find the first record he was looking for. Warcry, second order active skill, level 5. By imbuing mana into your vocal cords and slightly modifying the anatomy of your throat for a brief instant, release a fear-inflicting sound wave that freezes the movements of your opponent for a second. The distance the sound wave can travel depends on the user's mana stat, and the power of the effect can vary depending on the opponent's resistance. This skill cannot evolve on its own, and the evolution criteria are unknown. It consumes 70 mana points to activate, and has a cooldown time of 5 minutes. So this is the skill I learned at that time. Xietain pondered in his heart as the battle on the bridge replayed in his memory. Just then, when the zombie leader was about to stun Xietain with his special skill, and leave him open for attacks that could cost him his life, a sudden flash of inspiration struck Xietain as he saw the strange movements in the throat of the zombie leader. Although it was clearly a different skill than the one the zombie leader had roared, the power of the skill Warcry was unquestionable. The mere fact that it could freeze the enemy's movements due to fear was amazing to say the least, considering that in a battle between powerhouses, an instant was all that was needed to decide victory and defeat. Although it was a pity that the skill could not evolve on its own and the methods of evolution were unknown, Xietain was happy to be able to add a new trump card to his arsenal. With Warcry, Xietain would be able to take his enemies unawares if he played his cards right, and use the skill with the rest of his movements appropriately. Approximately 5 minutes later, Xietain found another crucial record that before the war on the bridge was not in his soul. Lonely Wolf Aura, second order active skill, level 5. By partially or fully releasing your killing intent, causes an intangible aura to surround your silhouette, and inflicts fear on your opponents, depending on the degree of killing intent released, which can result in total body freezing or partial loss of battle power as a consequence of demotivation. The skill does not distinguish between allies and enemies. The effect of the skill depends on the difference between your killing intent and the killing intent of those around you. It consumes 100 mana points to activate, and 1 mana point for every 5 seconds the skill stays active. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner and the Apocalypse. Chapter 562 Sixth Order Skill and Barbarian King. Chapter 562 Sixth Order Skill and Barbarian King. The effect of the skill Lonely Wolf Aura was undoubtedly powerful, as being able to decrease the overall battle power of the targets around the user could simply be described as colossally broken. While it was true that in the early stages of evolution this effect would not shine too brightly, in the higher stages the skill would surely show its true terror. Imagine a higher existence frozen in fear or losing power to the point where a lower existence would be able to kill it, even though Lilith had told him that the difference between the Fourth Order and the Fifth Order was as great, if not greater, than the difference between an unclassified existence and a Fourth Order existence. Xietain could not help but think that perhaps he would be able to overcome that vast abyss someday. Of course, whether these thoughts would stay as wishful fantasies or not was something which only fate and time would tell. However, it was certain that with the skill Lonely Wolf Aura, a new path had opened up in front of Xietain, a path that needed to be carefully explored, as he was so far unaware of the true extent of the power of this new skill of his. After some more rummaging through the records, discarding those he considered useless or not important enough to give a second glance, Xietain finally managed to find the record he was looking for. The last message of the soul record he had received during the war on the bridge that he had so far not seen, and honestly the one that Xietain was most interested to see, even though in his heart he already knew perfectly well what this record would describe, as it was a record he had learned on his own. You have unlocked and learned the unique skill Sixth Order Magic Break, which in the past belonged to the Barbarian King. Magic Break, Sixth Order Unique Skill, Level 5. With godly eyes and divine senses, you passively sense the flow of enemy magic in such a way that when a magic attack capable of causing damage to you is launched by those you consider enemies, you can understand the nature of said magic attack to a certain extent and decipher its weak point. Effect: you can break any magic attack visible to the naked eye that is one stage above the user's power level. Xietain opened his eyes abruptly and gasped as a flash of disbelief shone in his shocked gaze. What happened? Lilith asked hurriedly in an apprehensive voice as she watched how Xietan's eyes widened as big as saucers. What surprised Lilith the most, however, was the level of surprise and disbelief in Xietan's eyes. These two emotions reflected by his gaze had reached such a high level that it was hard to believe, considering that he had always kept his composure within reason, regardless of what was displayed before him. How amazing and unbelievable must what he had just seen be for him to have that kind of expression on his face. Lilith felt that another big surprise was coming. However, Xietain seemed not to have heard the voice of Lilith, as he was too busy with his own agitated emotions to worry about anything else at the moment. Sixth Order skill? And a unique skill at that? Dear God! Xietain almost choked to death when he forgot to breathe, and when he came back to his senses, he started gasping for air, as he was not prepared for this kind of shock. A Sixth Order skill? For the love of God! How Xietain muttered like a computer trying to find answers as he stared at the empty space in front of him. However, regardless of how much he thought about it, none of the theories he considered seemed to make any sense at all. While the title Brilliant Mind that Xietain had obtained not too long ago was amazing in terms of allowing him to learn and develop his own skills more easily, Xietain did not believe in any way that a title was able to magically grant him a skill that was not only so evolved, but was also a unique skill. Although he didn't know what a unique skill was at the present, Xietain was certain that such skills were above normal skills, just based on the fact that the other two skills of the same type that he had were already so powerful that they were scary. But how was it possible for him to attain such a skill out of nowhere? Xietain remembered that just at that moment, just as the beast leader's lightning-like magic attack stopped his fall in mid-descent and almost consumed him, he felt his soul grow warm and strong for an instant, but at the time that feeling was so fleeting that in the heat of war Xietain overlooked it. No matter how much he tried to remember, nothing came to his mind. Unfortunately, even if Xietain wanted to, it would probably be impossible for him to comprehend and know what it was that was deep in his soul, and what were those black lightning flashes with crimson edges that had caused the magic break skill to be engraved in his soul, as if it was natural. Xietain cleared his throat and took several deep breaths before looking at Lilith. Although he had tried to calm down, his voice was quite tight as he slowly asked, "Lilith, by any chance, do you know what unique skills are?" Unique skills? Lilith looked at him in surprise. A flash of pride shone in her eyes as she hurriedly asked, "You little scoundrel, did you learn a unique skill?" Xietain raised a hand in front of him to tell her to stop for a moment, and said in a serious voice, "First, explain to me about these skills, please." I need to understand the situation I'm in better so I can explain to you more about how things are. Oh, okay. Lilith nodded firmly. The enthusiasm in her voice was clear from how she stammered. Unique skills are unique skills, Lilith said after being silent for several seconds. Oi. Bai Zemin looked at her with a rotten face. Lilith coughed delicately, and after a moment she commenced, unique skills are called that way because they are skills that can only be possessed by one soul. It's complicated to explain, but let me give you an example to help you understand. Bai Zemin nodded seriously and Lilith explained. Let's say that on a table there are two blue-colored blueprints which have exactly the same drawing with exactly the same construction pattern on them. These blueprints were there for a long time until finally, two people arrived, and when they saw them they took the blueprints and started to study them, but surprisingly, only the first one in understanding the blueprint could build what was drawn there, while the other one could not do anything, even though the blueprint and the instructions were still intact. So, a unique skill is basically a unique skill? Bai Zemin almost fell to the ground when he said those words. Now you see, Lilith nodded as if she was proud. Bai Zemin was quite disappointed with this kind of explanation. While it sounded awesome that only one soul could contain X skill, what was the thing that made X skill amazing? This was what he most wanted to know. Seeing Bai Zemin's disappointed face, she quickly added, the reason why these skills are unique is because their power is on a completely different scale from all other skills, and even those that appear to be weak, fulfill characteristics and functions that a normal skill could never fulfill. Each unique skill can only be learned once for a single existence, as these skills can become a domain, and while there may be extremely similar domains in reality, there will always be some difference, no matter how slight. Domains? Like the ones in the novels? Bai Zemin asked with a raised eyebrow. Something similar. Lilith nodded and looked at him with weird eyes as she slowly said, I say, little brother Zemin, could it be that your knowledge is due to the novels? Hey, if it works then it works. I guess so. Bai Zemin wasn't too eager to inquire too much regarding the domains, as even without knowing so much about it, it was clear that they were things too distant for the current him. Too much information would only end up confusing him more, and might even cause him to forget things that were really important to him at the stage of evolution he was currently in. He would learn more about it when the time was right. For now, it was best to focus on what was really necessary and ignore the rest. He believed that this was the most optimal way to become more powerful, and considering that it had worked well so far, Bai Zemin would continue to act and think as such. Seeing Lilith looking at him with sparkling eyes similar to the eyes a fangirl would look at her super idol with, Bai Zemin felt a bit embarrassed, so he couldn't help but ask, Lilith, you have unique skills? I do have. She nodded with a smile on her face. Though unlike you, who managed to learn one in just 2 months, I took over 30 years to learn my first unique skill, since these skills normally can't be obtained from scrolls, unless a really powerful existence is killed, but even then, the victor would need to be very lucky for soul power to congregate in such a way. This Bai Zemin subconsciously looked away with a strange expression after listening to Lilith. She believed that he had only learned one unique skill. How will she react when she learns that he had learned 3 of them in less than a month and a half? Was she faint from shock? Bai Zemin secretly rubbed his hands together as he laughed like a little demon in his heart. However, before that, he needed to know something first. By the way, Lilith. He looked at her before she suspected anything and asked in a neutral voice, do you know someone named Barbarian King or something? Lilith frowned and slowly the excited smile on her face disappeared. Bai Zemin's question somehow served to show her that this case, just like everything around him, was not simple at all. Where did you learn about that name? She asked without much hope. For now, let's just say that this unique skill of mine is related to that person. Bai Zemin answered vaguely since he didn't know much either. Lilith looked into his eyes deeply before nodding and calmly saying, you better tell me everything later. I feel like the overlap regeneration surprise was nothing more than the starter dish. Haha. Bai Zemin tried to laugh without much effort, as the corner of his mouth twitched a couple of times upon hearing her saying that. After all, Lilith wasn't wrong. Overlap regeneration was nothing more than the starter dish. Lilith took a deep breath, causing her big chest area rose mightily before falling again, and after several seconds of silence that she needed to recapitulate a few things, she began her narration. The universe is vast and mysterious, so that even the most powerful higher existence would not dare to claim to have traversed it completely, let alone know it in its entirety. Therefore, the number of species could be said to be practically infinite. Among these species, there is one in particular that is quite special, since they cannot learn magic of any kind, due to their special physiques. Even so, that same physique that seemed to be a problem also presented the solution since, although the members of this race did not possess mana, they possessed another type of energy called will. Members of this particular race are known as barbarians. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner and the Apocalypse. Chapter 563 The Death of an Eighth Order Existence and the Terrifying Power of the Anti-Magic Domain. Chapter 563 The Death of an Eighth Order Existence and the Terrifying Power of the Anti-Magic Domain. Wait a moment, there is something I don't understand, and I would like to clear that doubt before you continue, or otherwise it will be harder for me to understand from here on. Xietain hurriedly interjected before Lilith could continue with her explanation. Yes? She looked into his eyes, and judging by the slight smile at the corner of her mouth, Xietain estimated that she already knew what he was going to ask. Still, he pointed out, Lilith, as I understood, the soul record plays the role of controlling the mana of the universe, and making all living beings somehow adapt to this energy, isn't it? So, how can it be that barbarians can exist and become a relevant race when their organisms are not fit for mana and magic? If the only function of the soul record that Lilith knew about other than reading, encoding, and decoding the soul power of the various existences of the universe was to move and control mana that was already on other worlds or bring said mana to worlds they didn't have, then how were the barbarians supposed to evolve? Will? This was the first time Xietain had heard of this energy system. Let me ask you instead, what happened to the humans who failed in adapting to mana and magic? Did the soul record kill them? Lilith asked rhetorically. Xietain frowned and thought seriously about the question Lilith had just asked him. Until now, to Xietain as much as to any other human, those humans who had failed to adapt to mana and turned into zombies as a result were no different from dead humans. However, he had changed his thoughts slightly several minutes ago, due to the small wooden pagoda he had obtained. Even then, Xietain had difficulty associating zombies with anything other than undead. His mentality might be limited by movies and books, as well as human legends about zombies, but in reality, it was also because once a human was turned into a zombie, all memories and emotions seemed to be erased, as even loved ones became nothing more than food for these zombies. Therefore, it was not much different from being dead. Hearing the reply from Xietain, Lilith smiled slightly and shook her head as she said in a tender voice, "Little brother, even though the zombies have ceased to be human, they are still beings that are alive. Otherwise, do you think one of the most powerful factions in the universe could be composed of dead? Death is when the soul of an existence is completely destroyed. Otherwise, as long as there is a soul, there can be no death. Basically, as long as an existence has some soul power, no matter how insignificant, then that existence is not really dead." Xietain muttered to himself, "That's right." Lilith nodded and continued, "When you kill zombies, you get some of the soul power of those zombies. So, this means that those zombies were alive before you absorbed their soul power. Even then, it is true that humans who turned into zombies after failing in adapting to mana no longer have and will never again have anything to do with the human race as in the past. The soul record, despite the fact that it may have minor flaws, is a practically perfect and righteous existence. I believe I have mentioned it to you before." Lilith pointed out with gravity on her face. "You think that an existence that was fair for countless years, since the creation of time, would erase a race just because it cannot adjust to mana? The reason why humans turned into zombies is because the human organism of those people failed in adapting to mana, and thus the soul record changed the race of those humans to zombies, therefore changing their organism as well, such that as they grow stronger, controlling mana and magic won't be a problem. When a TV set burned out due to power overload, all one had to do was to buy another one. If there was no way to repair the old one, even buying a very similar one was possible. Then, when a visitor came to your house, they would undoubtedly see a TV set just like the old one, but in reality, that TV set was completely different on the inside, as its parts were definitely not created at the same time as those of the old TV set. The case with zombies was similar, since as humans they failed to evolve. The soul record helped them in another way to avoid annihilating these failed products. Now I understand. Many things became clearer to me. Thank you for the explanation, Lilith." Xietain thought aloud as he stroked his storage ring with his thumb. "You're welcome," she smiled delightedly and continued, "So, continuing with the barbarians? Okay." He nodded and focused his full attention on her. "As I said a moment ago, since the barbarian's organism was not capable of adapting to mana and magic, the soul record could also turn them into a derivative race. However, such a thing was not necessary, since the barbarian's organism is so special that despite not being able to adapt to mana, it does not reject such energy, and instead absorbs it and converts it into will. Wouldn't this will be a derivative of mana? Xietain carefully pointed out. Indeed, the power of will might not be comparable to mana. Lilith nodded. However, as the barbarians evolve, the strength of these existences becomes truly terrifying to the point where several talents among them who achieved astonishing feats throughout the ages have managed to be born. Among these talents, the barbarian king was by far the most brilliant of all. While it is true that barbarians were not capable of casting magic spells, they could use will to utilize abilities that were actually not much different from magic, from the point of view of many. For example, by using will points to strengthen their legs, they could jump or run a lot faster than they should, they could use will points to roar like beasts and inflict fear on their opponents, and much more. The physical strength of the barbarians was such that even dragons whose physical bodies could be considered perfect dared not underestimate them. For some reason, Lilith sounded quite respectful when she talked about the barbarians. However, Xietain also noticed a tinge of pity in her voice. She slowly continued, when the physical strength of the barbarians reached a certain range, they could even freeze the surroundings using purely physical power, so that while they were not able to use magic, they could still fly through the skies by freezing. Xietain suddenly froze and stopped listening to what Lilith was saying as a flash of surprise glinted in his eyes. When the physical strength of the barbarians reached a certain range, they could freeze the surroundings and do something similar to flying. But hadn't he done something similar in Oblong World when his Blood Berserker's Wrath skill activated at the 3rd level of Wrath? Lilith, he interrupted. Lilith looked at him with questioning eyes, to which he responded with another question. Just out of curiosity, but the race it shows in my status window is the race 1 really am, right? It's not possible for some mistake to occur? At this point, Xietain was even starting to doubt his race, which didn't make much sense, since his parents were definitely just normal humans. Your race is your race, and that cannot be changed unless you ascend to a higher existence and join a faction or create your own. It is absolutely impossible for the soul record to make a mistake in reading souls, as this is its main strength. Lilith shook her head and said in a serious voice at Xietain's weird question. Xietain let out a sigh of relief in his heart. Although he still didn't understand many things, he doubted that Lilith had the answers to these questions that tormented him, since somehow Xietain was sure that only he could one day get to the bottom of all this. Lilith naturally felt that he was behaving somewhat strangely, but she believed that the reason would soon be revealed. Therefore, she continued, as I said before, the barbarian king was the brightest existence among the barbarians. The barbarian king was an existence that lived in the past, long before most of the leaders of higher existences were born, and according to the few recordings that remained and were not lost, he managed to become a powerful 8th Order warrior before he died. Xietain couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air when he heard what Lilith said at the end. An 8th Order existence died for God's sake. Could even something as powerful as that be killed? And here he was, being proud just because he could take on beings 2 orders above his own. How the hell can someone in the 8th Order even die? Isn't that like the peak of the universe? Xietain asked in a trembling voice. Since a higher existence did not die with the passage of time, then this could only mean that the barbarian king had been killed by someone else. Lilith shook her head and told Xietain not to ask too many questions regarding such things. Little brother, I'm only telling you this so that you can better understand your situation and tell me what's going on with your unique skill, but honestly, for now, you'd better not focus too much on such distant things. The higher existences were also facing their own problems. It was just that Xietain had no way of touching such a tall skyscraper with his hands at present, as his wings had only just begun to grow. Seeing Xietain nod slowly, Lilith smiled softly and continued. The barbarian king was characterized as the only barbarian to manage to comprehend the legendary anti-magic domain. When an existence stepped within a range of 3,000 meters around the barbarian king, that existence would immediately become unable to use any harmful spells or magic skills, and even flying would become a hard feat to accomplish, as only through constant consumption of mana could his enemies avoid falling to the ground. The voice of Lilith was filled with respect and at the same time slight fear as she mentioned about the anti-magic domain, something that Xietain understood very well. Even if he was a being capable of fighting melee with ferocity and prowess, Xietain knew that if someone with the ability to block his ability to activate magic appeared before him, he would probably find himself in extremely serious trouble that could lead to his death. Imagine fighting against an eighth-order existence whose physical body is comparable if not superior to that of a dragon, without being able to properly activate magic. Lilith smiled bitterly and shook her head. The anti-magic domain was one of the most powerful domains in the past, and even now it still causes everyone to tremble when someone names it. The anti-magic domain might seem simple as it did not grant power to the user at all, so in the hands of anyone it could be useless, as the anti-magic domain would naturally affect the user's skills as well. However, as Lilith had just said, the barbarian king had been a being whose strength was purely and exclusively centered on his physique. Therefore, he was like some kind of apocalypse for his enemies. The doom of the mages. Xietain called up the records of his skill magic break, and as he read them again, he couldn't help but wonder if he could ever learn a domain as powerful as that. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner and the Apocalypse. Chapter 564 Kiss. Chapter 564 Kiss. Lilith gave him some time to let Xietain finish processing what she had just revealed to him, in order to make it easier for him to explain how he had obtained his unique skill. However, Lilith had no way of knowing that in reality, he simply had no idea how he obtained this skill. Is your skill somehow related to the barbarian king? She asked after they were both in silence for almost 5 solid minutes. Lilith's voice was a bit heavy as to begin with. Any kind of skill related to a legendary existence, such as the barbarian king had once been, and who was still respected for his strength, despite being dead for millions of years, definitely could not be taken lightly. Xietain looked at Lilith with weird eyes when he heard her question. She asked if the unique skill he had just learned was related to the barbarian king. Far from being related, according to the records Xietain had received, magic break was a skill that belonged to the barbarian king, and after hearing the story of that existence, Xietain judged it to be the basis of the anti-magic domain. He smiled bitterly and let himself fall onto his back in a way that his whole body relaxed on the comfort of the bed. As he looked up at the ceiling free of decorations, he said quietly, "A little less than 2.5 months ago I thought I knew myself perfectly well. Now, a little less than 2.5 months later, I realize I don't even know myself." Just as Lilith occasionally asked, Xietain also wondered whether he was human or not, despite knowing the answer to this question. How was it possible that so many incredible things happened to him one after another? Sure, it felt awesome to know and feel his strength soar higher and higher. However, just like any other living being, Xietain feared the unknown. It was not easy for him to adapt to so many changes that not only affected the world, but were literally transforming who he once believed he was. Some struggled tens, hundreds, thousands of years to achieve something he had achieved in months. How could such a thing be considered normal? Far from normal, Xietain accepted that he was worthy of the title irregular, the sole record bestowed upon him just over a month earlier. "Are you okay?" Lilith looked at him with worried eyes. As she spoke in a voice as soft as a mother speaking to a small child trying not to scare him, she slowly moved such that the white sheets rustled softly with each movement, before lying down on her side next to him and looking at him carefully. Xietain sighed softly and wordlessly extended his left hand to his side. "I know what you will see now will shock you, you might even be frightened, but I'm sorry, Lilith. I don't want to hide anything about me from you, nor do I have the strength to slowly explain all the strange stuff that happened to me lately," he said wearily. Even though he had woken up about an hour ago, Xietain felt as if an eternity had passed. The feeling of not knowing oneself was much heavier than many would imagine. This was especially so for someone who less than half a year ago was nothing more than an ordinary human, in the midst of a society governed by rules that overnight collapsed. Lilith looked at the hand in front of her, waiting to be taken. However, she hesitated whether she should take it or not. Even though that big hand was the same hand she had taken on over 100 occasions to link part of her soul to his, somehow now it seemed to be different. This was the first time Lilith saw Xietain having such an exhausted look in his eyes, and for a second she even thought that he might collapse and give up completely. The hesitation of Lilith only lasted for an instant before her eyes flashed with resolution. Whatever the reasons why his spirit was so low, she was sure she would find out once she took his hand. Only then would she be able to help him. Now, Lilith only hoped she wouldn't get too scared, because even she, who was one of the most powerful existences under the vast firmament, could no longer be so sure of the surprises that the little man lying next to her would bring her. Even so, Lilith was an existence that had experienced many ups and downs in her life despite being relatively young. She, who had seen light and darkness, knew that stopping and stagnating was the most horrendous way to expect to be devoured. Therefore, she needed to move forward. Lilith and Zemon's hands joined as she took his, forming a great anatomical contrast between them. And so, as she lay down beside him and joined him in staring at the ceiling, he linked the parts of his soul that contained the important records he wished to share with the woman who had been there when he needed warmth the most. Void Fist, Third Order Skill, Brilliant Mind, Savior of the World, Destroyer of Destroyers, 1 vs Millions, All for One. Third Order, Unique Skill, God of War's Will. Third Order Skill, Blood Pact, with the Endless Blue Lotus Flame, one of the flames once found among the few God-grade natural treasures. One after another, the most astonishing records that Zemon had achieved were reflected in Lilith's pupils, and for every second that passed the expression on her face became harder and harder to read. When disbelief reached a certain point, the brain automatically cut off many emotions to avoid a possible collapse from overload, leaving nothing but indifference. In such a short time, Zemon had received a special title which allowed him to learn skills and develop them as if it were nothing. He attained a title related to salvation, and another to destruction, which were extremely rare. He developed by himself several unique skills which even higher existences did not necessarily possess. He even formed a soul pact with a legendary flame that could spread to the ends of the universe and burn everything. Among these records were also the incredible feats that Zemon had accomplished in Oblong World when he decided to invade in order to break the invasion of the Asura race. From annihilating armies of millions to massacring over 200 second-order existences, along with the direct killing of 2 third-order existences, all the most important details of Oblong World flashed across Lilith's pupils. She even detected slight traces of combat against fourth-order existences there, which even if they were not enough to grant soul power, would definitely serve to make Zemon's mission of advancing to the fourth order slightly easier, since with these records, the barrier from the third to the fourth order would be easier to break through. However, what made Lilith's heart almost stop was one record in particular, one that she never expected to see here. Blood Berserker's Wrath, Unique Skill. Lilith clearly felt her heart clench tightly, as if a pair of invisible hands were trying to crush it, and she had to tighten her precious teeth to prevent any sort of sound from escaping her mouth. She wanted to look Zemon in the eye and ask him how it was possible for him to have that skill. However, what little reasoning she had left after all the things she had just seen reminded her that even if she asked him, he wouldn't have the answer she wanted. It wasn't easy for Lilith. It wasn't easy for her to keep her composure within reasonable limits. However, Lilith's mentality was still the same. If a woman one day wanted to become the partner of an existence that was undoubtedly destined to become the most brilliant of all, if he did not fall young just like Zemon, then that woman first needed to understand and support him. Now that Lilith understood the reason why Zemon felt overwhelmed, she preferred to swallow her own pain and fight the fears that threatened to drive her to madness in order to support him. Because unlike a young girl, Lilith was a real woman with a lot of experience in life. She was the type who, once her heart began to love a man, preferred to be secretly pricked by 1,000 needles than to let a single one cause pain to her loved one. Lilith still clung tenderly to Zemon's hand when the link between her soul and his was broken. She lay beside him, silent as she looked up at the ceiling with dazed eyes. Maybe, feeling the warmth of the woman next to her, maybe, it was thanks to that exquisite scent of roses that soothed him. However, as the seconds passed to turn into minutes, Zemon felt his own insecurity begin to settle until it reached an acceptable level. After a long time, he said quietly, "Crazy, don't you think? Perhaps to you or others it may be strange that I, who wishes to become the most powerful being in the universe for the sake of my current loved ones, and those I will love, actually feel insecure just because I am getting stronger even without being able to assimilate more soul power temporarily." Zemon made a pause and Lilith stayed silent, focused solely on listening to him, while inwardly trying to calm her fears. "Yes, I want to be the strongest. But at what price? At the price of losing myself?" He thought in a voice low enough to sound like a whisper, but loud enough for the woman beside him to hear. "Is all this strength really mine? Am I that Zemon I always knew? No, to begin with, who am I? Rather, what am I? At this point, even if I'm just a human, I refuse to believe that I'm a normal human like the rest." Identity problems. These were problems Lilith had seen in many existences, and had even experienced for herself in the past, when her life became a living hell after the apocalypse came to her homeworld. After all, the abrupt changes were too great to take them all in with a smile on the face as if nothing happened. However, the identity problem that Zemon was experiencing at the moment was much, much greater than anyone else's. But Lilith knew that this was perfectly justified given all the mystery that enveloped not only him, but also the world he was born and raised in. Take the second most powerful person in the entire faction, Shangyun Bingshu, as an example. The current Changyuan Bingshu was strong enough to turn a smaller-sized city into a frozen hell at will if she completely broke free, which was insane, considering that just a little less than 2.5 months ago, she was nothing more than a college student. However, if Bai Zemin broke free completely and without restriction, then possibly life on Earth would end unless the world evolved first. Each and every one of Bai Zemin's skills, including his treasures, strangely matched each other perfectly, turning him into something that could no longer be categorized as a monster. So, it was normal to not know himself. It was by no means easy to accept a new self and not know your former self that had been with you for 20 years, even less so when it seemed that everything was destined, as if your movements had been thought out in advance by something superior and was controlling you without you realizing it. Maybe it was to help calm him down, or maybe it was to calm her own heart. However, before Bai Zemin could come out of the dazed state he was in, Lilith moved gently and in a tender and seductive movement, she put her red lips on his. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner and the Apocalypse. Chapter 565 Love capable of breaking down any barrier. Chapter 565 Love capable of breaking down any barrier. How did it feel to be kissed by that person who occupied our thoughts during most of the day? How did it feel to close the physical and spiritual distance between that person who, unbeknownst to us, managed to slip through the cracks of our day-to-day life? Those who have experienced it would probably be the only ones able to answer such questions, but even then, the odds of always receiving the same answers did not stand out much. Bai Zemin, too, had his time when he pondered such questions. He too was an innocent young man who longed to love and be loved. However, life and fate had different plans for him. From a very early age, he was forced to see the reality of the world before his eyes. He was forced to understand the hard way that the real world was not the beautiful fantasy worlds where the main character always had his happy ending with the beautiful heroine of his story. Heartbroken, feeling betrayed by people he thought would never hurt him, but who in the end stabbed him in the back and crushed his heart, almost bringing him to collapse. After living through such an experience, Bai Zemin had given up on love. Those childish goals such as buying a beautiful house, marrying a pretty girl, and having a happy family were discarded to focus more on something that, while it might not be the best, at least, it would not destroy him. Loneliness, after all, did not stab those who walk with it, in the same way that darkness did not scare away those who did not fear it. Therefore, he had decided to walk alone. That was until a little over 2 months ago when he met a woman who was not even human, but who managed to turn his life upside down, just as the soul record had turned the world on its head. Bai Zemin didn't know what love was. There probably wasn't even a correct or 100% accurate definition of it, since, besides the ever-present scientific definition, there were countless definitions that depended on the feelings of countless others. However, he knew he was falling in love. There was no need to ask himself why, he simply knew it by the way his stone heart beat with the might of an earthquake every time she came too close to him. He simply knew it by how those rocks around his heart cracked violently for every time his heart shuddered when she looked at him with sweet eyes. But there was something that Bai Zemin had never stopped to think about, and that was if his heart was beating so hard that it threatened to stop spontaneously at the sound of her voice alone, what would happen if their lips touched? The result was colossal, even more so for a young man who, after refusing love for most of his life for fear of being hurt, when he felt those two full lips as soft as silk joining his own, Bai Zemin felt his entire soul shudder with bliss. Although Lilith simply pressed her lips on his to show her affection for him, and it was by no means a lustful kiss, the sweet taste of her mouth was so delicious that Bai Zemin was willing to live only with her kisses and feed by her lips for the rest of his life. He was even willing to give up the air of the outside world for the sake of breathing her breath as addictive as drugs. This time, he, who was fully aware of the sensations of his body, not to miss the slightest feeling of those two precious lips, that probably countless men of countless races longed for at least once in their lives, but that at least for now only belonged to him, managed to notice something that had so far slipped out of his detection due to different circumstances. When Lilith's lips touched his, just as his soul trembled as if it had received a spiritual shock, and at the same time as his heart beat fiercely, as if he had been injected with large doses of dopamine all at once, the rune of the skill stone heart recorded in his soul also began to tremble. If the trembling of his soul was like the friction between two tectonic plates, then the stone heart skill rune was the earth in the middle with no hope but to suffer the consequences. The cracks that were already there widened at astonishing speeds, widening and lengthening more and more, until there came a point where Bai Zemin could not understand how something that was so broken could even continue to stand. The kiss, far from being like the kiss between an adult man and woman, and more like the embarrassed but full of pure and real feelings kiss between a kid and a girl hiding from their parents, lasted about half a minute. That half a minute seemed to last an eternity, but for Xietain, it felt like an eternity that didn't last long enough. Slowly, Lilith began to pull her head back, not before puckering her lips one last time for a final kiss, which this time was loud enough to be heard amidst the silence. Eyes as black as midnight met eyes almost as red as blood, while a silky smooth dark curtain fell over the sides of the face of the beautiful demoness, who looked as shy as an innocent maiden, despite her race being succubus. With Lilith's hair acting as a curtain that caressed Xietain's face with every little movement of hers, he felt its softness, and could sense a scent as sweet as natural honey, emanating from each strand. He noticed a slight blush on her face as proof of her shyness, but that naughty little pink tongue that peeked out from inside her mouth to lick the lips that a moment ago were his exposed that despite feeling a little shy, Lilith was not willing to let go of the taste of his lips that still lingered on hers. The two remained silent as they gazed into each other's eyes until Lilith slowly sat up in bed. She secretly watched him as she fiddled with her fingers nervously because, regardless of her age or lived experiences, she too was completely new in the matter of emotions. It was not easy for Lilith, who was slowly discovering her own heart, to take such a bold step. As a man, Xietain felt it was his responsibility to be the first to break the silence that oscillated between discomfort and comfort. After all, the woman had already taken the first big step very bravely. It would be quite miserable of him to let the lady do everything. Therefore, instead of overthinking it and saying words he didn't really feel, he decided to be honest with his own heart, and said the first thing he felt and thought. "Thank you." "Thank you?" She looked at him in confusion, to which he responded with a small smile brimming with gratitude. "Thank you. Thank you for helping me regain my composure. Thank you for being by my side in the darkest moments of my life. Thank you for being my guide. Thank you for teaching me everything I know. Thank you for existing. Thank you for coming in my path. If not for you, Lilith, then the human known as Xietain might have long ago been devoured by the mouth of some mutant creature." Lilith felt as sweet as if she had eaten honey when she saw the eyes with which Xietain looked at her. Hearing the tenderness in his voice as he spoke to her, as well as the deep meaning behind every thank you he uttered, caused silent ripples in her heart, just like delicate raindrops falling on a lake that had been quiet for a long time. For many, it might be hard to believe that this Xietain in front of her was the same Xietain who did not hesitate twice to cut off the heads of his enemies with cold eyes. Many might not believe that the soft voice belonged to the same person whose indifferent and cold voice was capable of sending chills to the soul. However, to Lilith, this was the same old Xietain. "Don't fight against what you are, you will lose," advised Lilith with a smile that oscillated between happiness and sadness, as she knew very well how horrible it was to be unfamiliar with oneself. Seeing that Xietain kept silent, Lilith mistakenly thought that it was still not enough. Therefore, not knowing that he had actually already found the answer he was looking for when she kissed him, she continued, "In the end, regardless of whether you are a hero, monster, human, you are you." Lilith blushed slightly and whispered, "When you are in doubt of your existence, try to feel the warmth of my lips. It might help you to find your way back home." This girl, how could she be so cute? Xietain sighed in his heart. Every gesture, every word, whether subconsciously or not, everything about her was fatal to men. "Don't worry," he said, lifting his back from the bed and sitting beside her. "What I must do has not changed. Be it monster or human, none of it matters. Which would you prefer, live as a monster or die as a good man? I will be nightmare and destruction if necessary, not to mention abandoning all humanity to survive and ensure the well-being of those I love." Xietain said this time with that light of confidence in his gaze that had been missing for a few minutes before. Now, Xietain had another doubt, and that doubt was, why isn't Stoneheart evolving? He frowned in his heart as he looked at the completely cracked skill rune, so much so that Xietain could see a glimmer of bright light escaping through the cracks, as if something was about to emerge, but for some reason could not. All the requirements had been met except one: falling in love. Xietain was pretty sure that he already loved Lilith to the point of being willing to sacrifice himself for her. Even if he had to give every drop of his blood for her safety, he would not hesitate. So, that wasn't love? Wasn't it love to long to see that person every second? Wasn't it love to want to spend the rest of his life with her? Wasn't it love that his head was full of her? So what was love really? Maybe I've been in the darkness too long, so much so that I love the security it gives me. Maybe I've fallen deeply in love with the loneliness that never betrays. Xietain didn't realize it, but he said his thoughts out loud, and as a result Lilith naturally heard him. It was not difficult for her to draw conclusions and understand what he was thinking. Although Lilith was surprised, even so, her lips moved on their own, just as the words that came from her heart automatically came out of her mouth. Don't worry. I will hold you to feel my warmth every day, and someday, I will steal you from the loneliness that doesn't want to let you go. Lilith's eyes widened in shock as she didn't know why she suddenly said what she said. On the other hand, Xietain looked at her with his mouth slightly open in a show of surprise. However, he soon smiled slightly and said in a soft voice, I will wait for that day to come. He could feel that, perhaps, there was something holding him back. He didn't know what that something was, but it was definitely there. Perhaps, the love that the soul record spoke of, or rather demanded as a requirement for the evolution of Stoneheart, and the possible appearance of a new skill, was actually a colossal love so great that every barrier would be broken by its presence. If that was the case, then perhaps it was normal that the skill had not yet evolved despite all the cracks, barely holding on to the brink of collapse. Irrespectively, Xietain believed that Lilith was the only woman who could help him complete that requirement. As to whether he was right or wrong, only fate will tell. Chapter 566 Barbarian King's Anti-Magic Domain and Sirius's Annihilation of the Falling Sky. So, what did you think about my new records? Awesome, right? Xietain asked with a smile similar to that of a small child who had received many gifts for Christmas. Having solved his identity problem with the opportune help of Lilith, Xietain finally stopped worrying about things like the source of the strength he received, whether it came from him or from a past life. Whatever it was now his strength, and he would gladly use it to achieve his goals. Even though he didn't know very much about himself, even though he didn't know if he really had a past life or not, Xietain knew that he was him. His movements, his thoughts, his goals, everything belonged to him and only to him. Lilith looked at him with an extremely serious expression on her face, and for an instant, Xietain even wondered if the kiss they shared before had been nothing more than an illusion on his part. However, he soon dismissed that thought as he felt the warmth and lingering softness on his lips, as he was sure that if he licked the surface, he would be able to taste her taste lightly. This naughty little succubus really knows how to differentiate between relationships and work, thought Xietain, secretly chuckling. Xietain, I need you to listen to me properly. Not only was her expression serious, but even the tone of voice bordered on the tone a mother would use to advise her son when things became difficult, or when he was about to step into an important but new stage of his life. Therefore, Xietain also stopped joking when she even called him by his name, and nodded to show her that his attention was completely focused on her. As you may well know, when an existence is on the boundary between two orders, the soul record sends us a quest which we need to fulfill in order to continue moving forward. Lilith began to explain as she looked at him without blinking. After a pause, she asked, Do you know why it is like this? No. Xietain shook his head without hesitation. How could he know? All he could think of was that the soul record tested all existences to see if they were worthy of continuing to advance or not. Lilith looked thoughtful for a moment, but suddenly her face became somewhat complicated as she looked at Xietain and said without knowing whether to laugh or cry, Do you remember what happens when the main characters of cultivation novels reach the highest peak of the cultivation realm they are in? Novels? Xietan's eyes flashed and he quickly replied, Of course, I remember. When the characters of a cultivation novel reach the highest stage of the cultivation realm, they usually stagnate for months and even years in order to break through the barrier that. Xietain suddenly stopped as he finally realized something he had always been overlooking. Seeing the expression on his face, Lilith smiled slightly and continued, That's right. That barrier that stops the cultivators of the novels is something similar to what you feel. Try to push your soul power higher. You should have a lot of soul power stored up to be able to push. Even though it wasn't necessary to do so since he had done it many times during the past days and knew perfectly well what would happen, Xietain obeyed Lilith and tried to push his soul power to absorb what was right there, but for some reason, it didn't join the rest of his strength. However, it was no surprise when his soul power bounced back with a rumble that shook his soul, as it hit something he had no way of seeing. Lilith naturally felt the fluctuation of soul power, so she understood that he had just done what she had asked him to do. Then, she nodded and continued with her explanation. The reason why the soul record gives us a breakthrough quest every time we reach the maximum level of the order we are in is because we need to accumulate certain records that without them, it will be impossible for our soul to gather the strength needed to break through the barrier blocking the next level. Only by attaining such records and accumulating soul power throughout the process will our souls have the necessary impetus to push us beyond both spiritually and physically. Xietain felt as if a new world had opened up before him once Lilith finished explaining these matters. There was no need to ask the reason why she was only explaining this to him now, since he had only just reached the limit of the First Order not too long ago. However, he felt it was strange that she would bring up this topic just now. Undoubtedly. The next instant, she again put a serious expression on her face and pointed out, when we are in the process of evolution between the peak of one order and the beginning of the order that follows it, our souls usually do not absorb any more records, except for meager precious foods that we have never tasted before, and that exceed our soul power range. However, tens of years, centuries, and even millennia can pass without an existence that is on the verge of breakthrough, becoming even a little bit stronger. Lilith paused and narrowed her eyes as she slowly said, "But you, on the other hand, continue to absorb records as if nothing. Even though your soul power isn't growing and its purity isn't increasing, the amount of records being added to your soul is definitely abnormal. Most abnormal of all, the soul record seems to favor you." "Favor me?" Xietain was surprised a lot when he heard this. He looked at Lilith with wide eyes and recalled, "Aren't you making a mistake, Lilith? If the soul record really favored me, then why is it giving me these quests?" But then, Xietain paused as he realized that he could now reach that answer by himself. "You seem to understand now." Lilith nodded. "The soul record does not impose difficult quests on you. The soul record simply decodes the records your soul needs to evolve, and shows them to you in translated messages in a way that you and all of us can understand. Try to imagine what would happen if it were not for the fact that the soul record shows us these messages. How long would it take an existence to acquire the necessary records, if it doesn't even know what it needs to complete? The path you walk, from the moment you became a blood berserker, is destined to be steep," she pointed out earnestly. "The stronger and bigger the path you wish to build, the firmer the materials you use must be, or else sooner or later it will collapse completely, just like a stone road trampled for several years." I understand." Xietain nodded slowly as he looked at his hands, and recalled everything that had happened to him so far. Even though the evolution requirements he was up against were getting crazier and crazier, it was true that the rewards he got every time he succeeded were juicy enough to drive anyone mad. His blood berserker job, for example, once Xietain succeeded, those first-order beasts that always gave him headaches were no longer a challenge at all, even if they came in groups. He suddenly raised his head and asked something he noticed recently. "Lilith, do you remember when we first met?" Lilith looked at him confused but still nodded. She would never forget that day even if she was beaten to death, as it was at that very moment when time that for her had been frozen, finally began to move once again. If not for Xietain, Lilith would be no different from a wandering spirit trying to find something that she might never find, and all her goals would be left unfulfilled. Moreover, she herself would be like a killing and repeating machine, with no purpose of her own to aspire to. Therefore, while it was true that Xietain owed much to her, she also owed a lot to him. Having no idea of Lilith's thoughts and feelings, Xietain asked again, "Do you remember what you told me back then? If I'm not mistaken, back then you said something about my stats, especially magic and mana, being particularly high. Actually, at the time I put it that way so you wouldn't get too many heirs, but honestly your magic and mana were too high. That's probably why your other stats were also above average, because of the effect the mana had on your body." Lilith pointed towards Xietan's chest and slowly said, "At the time I didn't show it, but I was really surprised that you were still alive, and your body didn't explode into a million of pieces." Xietan's body trembled in fear, and his face turned pale for an instant. After all, what Lilith said was not crazy at all, considering that his soul at that moment should be too powerful for a human physical body to withstand. He coughed to clear his throat and nodded as he said, "Yeah, well, leaving aside the last part, my soul was always stronger than normal, stronger than it should be. So, I was wondering if maybe my soul could be that of some powerful being from the past." Lilith's eyes and Xietan's gaze met for a long time before she sighed. "Why did you think of that all of a sudden?" You see, I wasn't so sure before, but lately, I've started to doubt all this a lot." Xietain frowned slightly, and as he turned his face to look towards the wall in front of him he said casually, "The endless lotus blue flame was once a flame whose strength had the power to threaten gods and demons alike. When its previous master was defeated and killed, this treasure refused to form a soul pact with any other existence, and had it not reached some sort of agreement with the soul record it would have disappeared long ago. However, out of nowhere, this little flame showed up before me when I broke an epic great orb and asked to form a soul pact with me. Without altering his voice or pace, he continued, on the other hand, there is also the more recent fact. According to the records I obtained, the 6th order skill Magic Break was not simply learned, but also unlocked. But, isn't it implied that to unlock something that something must already be there to begin with? With Magic Break in the future, I could learn the anti-magic domain that was once the signature mark of the Barbarian King. Finally, Xietain brought a hand to his chest, and seeing his movement, Lilith sighed in her heart and slowly closed her eyes. Last but not least, there's also this. Swoosh. The air inside the room stagnated for a second before the curtains shook violently, followed by a bright flash of gold-colored light which illuminated Lilith's face. She slowly opened her eyes, meeting Xietan's slow but easy movement, in which with his right hand, he pulled out an object enveloped by a bright flash of light from inside his body. Finally, there is this spear. Annihilation of the Falling Sky, that is its name. Xietain tightened his grip on the soul armament, and the golden light surrounding it burst out, turning into particles of light that floated in the room for several seconds. With her face and outline illuminated by the golden light particles, Lilith looked like an even more beautiful goddess than she already was. Her expression was calm and the inside of her eyes as serene as an ancient lake, as she gazed at the exquisite spear in the hands of the young man at her side. You really had it in you after all. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner and the Apocalypse. Chapter 567 If not reincarnated then linked. Chapter 567 If not reincarnated then linked. Xietain stared at the golden spear in his right hand intently. This weapon had saved his life, appearing from a space crack that, unlike the cosmos gate opened by the Asura race, looked like a spatial rift formed after the destruction of space itself. Even if Xietain had no idea who the real owner of this weapon was, somehow it had to be an ally, or else there was no way a random stranger would decide to save his life, just because the weather was nice that day. As for it being a soul armament, while Xietain wasn't quite sure, just based on the word soul, he could conclude a thing or two from it. However, the biggest question that Xietain had was, who was the true owner of the golden spear in his hands? Just as he was lost in his own world, he heard the voice of Lilith at his side. You really had it in you after all. Huh? He turned to look at her in surprise. What do you mean by that? Lilith didn't answer right away, and instead stared at the golden spear with eyes that constantly flashed with complicated emotions. Unlike Xietain, Lilith knew perfectly well who that spear belonged to, and also knew part of its history. He didn't know, but she was fully aware that countless existences, from lower existences to higher existences, with a little knowledge in respect to the weapon Xietain held, would be willing to destroy entire worlds for the sake of getting their hands on it. May I? Lilith asked, raising her face to look at Xietain, while pointing at the golden spear with her right index finger. Yeah, sure. Xietain nodded easily despite the doubts that weighed on his heart. It wasn't that he doubted Lilith regarding stealing the weapon, far from it, it was just that Xietain realized from the previous words she had said, as well as her current slightly strange behavior, that maybe Lilith knew the history of the golden spear, she might even be connected to this artifact. When her slender right hand came into direct contact with the golden spear, the coldness of the unfamiliar material was transmitted directly to her brain. The surface was rough due to the magical prints that seemed to have lost all their power, which made it easy to grip. However, Lilith realized that although this was the same annihilation of the falling sky that the ghost of the heavenly wolf Sirius had wielded, and with which it had terrified the most powerful higher existences in the entire universe, it could not really be considered the same either. Why does it feel so weak? She muttered as a glint of confusion flashed in her red eyes. She looked carefully at the magical prints, and after a few seconds she remembered that when the ghost of the heavenly wolf Sirius held the weapon, the golden spear, it had a faint crimson glow surrounding its outline, and the magical prints on the surface released an ominous, opaque red glow as dark as blood. Now, however, except for the color of the material that had been used to craft it and the magic-less runes, as well as the shape of the weapon, this annihilation of the falling sky was not at all like that divine weapon, capable of shattering space into thousands of pieces, and traveling at speeds that would make a fool of any of the 8 most powerful existences in the universe. Lilith tried to read the records of the weapon, but to her surprise, there was actually no message in her retina. This was extremely rare since as long as an existence desired it, the soul record would always show the records an object had been built with, or how it had been born. Unless her eyes suddenly widened in shock for a moment before quickly calming down. Of course, soul armament. Lilith muttered as she nodded. Annihilation of the falling sky was the weapon that had been the companion of Sirius in his countless exploits. It was not at all uncommon for the Heavenly Wolf to have made it his sole armament. Hello? Can you explain what's going on? Xietain finally couldn't surprising it anymore, so he decided to interject Lilith's thoughts. Oh, sorry. Lilith quickly looked at him smiling and apologized in embarrassment. Xietain smiled bitterly and said softly, looks like you already know my new friend. Your new friend? She looked at him in surprise before slapping her forehead with her free hand and muttering, of course you just pulled annihilation of the falling sky out of the inside of your body. Lilith raised her face to look at Xietain. She looked at him intently for several seconds, and before he began to feel a little uncomfortable, she finally asked calmly, did you form a soul contract with the spear? No. Xietain shook his head and asked with a frown, you didn't see the weapon's records? Lilith extended her right hand slightly and silently signaled Xietain to take the spear back. Once he got the weapon from her, she shrugged her shoulders and stood up with a small hop. Lilith? Xietain watched her slim back as she walked away towards the large window on the other side of the room. Lilith brought her hands behind her back, and just like an innocent girl devoid of impurities and negative thoughts, she walked between little hops towards the window. With a single thought, the mana of her body moved, and the curtain that covered the sunlight opened next to the sliding window, such that the evening breeze began to circulate inside the bedroom. Her black dress tightened firmly on her figure and delicately hugged every curve of her body, emphasizing even more her slender waist that seemed extremely flexible, just like a ballet dancer. As she looked up at the blue sky, she said in a calm voice, soul armaments are different from any other normal armaments. Unlike a weapon or armor which you can literally forge using anything, soul armaments have strict requirements to be born. Also, another distinct difference is that while anyone within the soul record power system can read the records of a piece of equipment, only the one who formed a soul contract with a soul armament can read the records of that piece of equipment. The room was silent for a couple of seconds before she continued without altering her pace or voice. That's why I asked you earlier if you had already formed a soul contract with annihilation of the falling sky, because if you can already see the records of the spear in your hands, then it can only mean that it already belongs to you, right? Oh, by the way, a soul contract is similar to a soul pact, but unlike the soul pact, the contract is countless times deeper. As Xietain looked at Lilith's back in detail, he couldn't help but marvel again at her natural charm and otherworldly beauty, which even after seeing her every day for over a full month, wasn't even close to enough. He felt that no matter how much he looked at her, it would be impossible to get bored. Could this also be attributed to his feelings for her growing up? Xietain did not know. What he did know, however, was that for some strange reason Lilith seemed much more carefree now. Just from the tone of her voice, Xietain noticed that the current Lilith felt lighter than before, as even her shoulders looked straighter and firmer than earlier. But, Lilith, he spoke, and while keeping his eyes fixed on her back he pointed out, annihilation of the falling sky, and I haven't formed a soul contract yet. Lilith fell silent for almost a full minute when she heard Xietan's words, and he didn't interrupt her as she seemed too thoughtful. After almost 60 seconds of silence in which she thought and he watched her back without saying a word, Lilith finally asked, why haven't you formed a soul contract yet? It's not that I don't want to, I just don't know how. Xietain smiled bitterly and proceeded to read the records recorded in annihilation of the falling sky for her to catch up with him. After listening to his words, Lilith once again fell silent. Except this time Xietain couldn't hold back and asked in a hopeful voice, can you help me? According to the current description, as long as I form a soul contract with this weapon, the true power of annihilation of the falling sky will be revealed. Xietain was certain that with the true power of this weapon, he would be able to crush everything in his path. His instinct told him so. Therefore, he always wanted to form a soul contract with annihilation of the falling sky. Unfortunately, he had no clue about it. I'd like to help you, but in this case, I'm afraid you're on your own, little brother. Lilith's reply was not long in coming, and in a clear voice she pointed out, even I don't have a soul armament, so while I know a thing or two about it, it really isn't much more than you do. Even you don't have one? Xietain asked in astonishment. In his eyes, Lilith was a supreme existence capable of controlling the winds and rains at will. If someone were to ask Xietain who would win in a fight between Lilith and the Demon Lord or the God of the Bible, he would without hesitation bet all his chips on Lilith. His confidence in her was blind, and his admiration practically touched the clouds. Therefore, he was very surprised that she did not possess a soul armament. You little scoundrel, didn't you hear what I said before? Lilith chuckled with her back to him. Soul armaments are priceless treasures as they are the ultimate equipment that will accompany an existence for the rest of their life. They are not easy to forge, and only a few existences know the secret to building one. I am not even 1 century old, and so there are many things unknown to me in the universe that I need to explore. I see. Xietain nodded even though she couldn't see it. But, leaving aside the matter of whether or not I have a soul armament, I think we can now confirm 2 things. Lilith said in a clear voice, finally turning around to face Xietain. With the golden sunlight falling on her silhouette and with the sun partially covered by her seductive body, Lilith looked so beautiful that Xietain lost his breath for an instant. His eyes were drawn to her as strongly as bees are drawn to honey. It was inevitable not to admire and appreciate her. Oh? And what is that? He asked as if in some kind of trance. Lilith's eyes sparkled with a hint of joy as she felt Xietan's gaze. Even though Lilith ignored and even disdained the stares of all men regardless of race as she had grown accustomed to them, what woman wouldn't feel happy when the man they could spend a lifetime with looked at them the way he was looking at her? Secretly happy for several reasons, she extended her right hand forward with her index finger extended upward, while the other 4 clenched into a small white fist. First, your soul is definitely special. It may be your soul or something that makes it up that makes you different, but you are definitely not like other humans or any other race within my range of knowledge. Huh? Xietain blinked in surprise, finally regaining his composure and looking at her in amazement at what Lilith had just said. But she didn't give him time to ask anything as her middle finger of the same hand extended to keep the lone index finger company. Second and last but not least, Lilith's eyes shone brightly, and she said in a clear voice, "Little brother, even if you are not the reincarnation of the heavenly wolf Sirius, you must absolutely be deeply linked to this legendary existence and his constellation." Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner and the Apocalypse. Chapter 568 Lilith's Daddy. Chapter 568 Lilith's Daddy. That's right, Xietain had to admit that the 2 points highlighted by Lilith were points which he had somehow already managed to point out by himself. However, he still couldn't help but frown slightly and ask, "Why? What do you mean by why?" Lilith asked back as she looked at him blinking. Xietain stayed in silence for a moment before rephrasing his question. "You said just now that my soul is definitely special. At the very least, it is not a soul similar to that of any other existence, and I must admit that I agree with you. However, I would like to know the reason why you think like that." While Xietain also believed that his soul was special or something inside him made him special, he needed to find a logical reason behind this thought, and that was precisely what he was looking for from Lilith. After all, judging by her confident expression, Xietain estimated that she had her reasons for making such a bold statement. "Oh, about that, it's actually easy." Lilith clapped her hands once and pointed at the golden spear in the hands of Xietain, as she slowly said, "The reason why your soul cannot be normal is because even without forming a soul contract with the soul armament in your hands, you are still able to see its stats and engraved records. Even if they are only partial records and not 100% of the real ones, a normal existence would not even be able to see a single record. Therefore, your soul probably has some attribute that allows you to read or understand the records of anything." As to whether Lilith's theory was true or not, it would be verified in the future when some anomaly similar to the soul contract happened. However, she was 90% sure because of the little pink dolphin that was currently watching everything from the big armchair next to the bed and had not moved since Xietain fell into deep sleep. Xietain lowered his head, and as he looked at the floor he pondered on the words Lilith had said to him a few minutes ago. She had told him a few minutes ago that she could not read the records of annihilation of the falling sky because she was not the owner of the soul armament. However, Xietain was also not the actual owner of the soul armament, but still, he could read partial records of it. Therefore, what she had just said was quite plausible. Xietain estimated that his soul or something within him allowed him to adapt to the records of others or, crazier than that, slightly modify those records that did not belong to him to better suit him in such a way that even the power of the soul armaments could not be completely hidden from his sight. Right. The first point is plausible, Xietain admitted as he looked at Lilith again. Then he continued, "But what about the second point? According to you, even if I am not the reincarnation of the heavenly wolf Sirius, I must be linked in some way or another. Could you please explain a little more?" Lilith looked deeply at him for several seconds, narrowing her eyes and saying word by word. "To begin with, the reason I believe you must be related Sirius and to his constellation is because there is no way that the remaining power spirit that had stayed hidden deep inside the constellation of the heavenly wolf for millions and millions of years decided to come out just when a deadly war was raging on a distant world. Moreover, if you are not linked to the heavenly wolf, then it would make no sense that his ghost left behind before disappearing without a trace would suddenly decide to stop attacking the invaders to throw its spear and save a lower existence from certain death. The expression on Xietain's face changed completely, and he subconsciously jumped to his feet. "How do you know?" he asked in surprise and shock. While Xietain had told her about him invading Oblong World, and even though he had shown her some records, Lilith shouldn't know how he almost died, and the golden spear in his hand saved him after appearing out of nowhere. After all, he had yet to tell her these details. "Do you remember what I told you at the beginning of this conversation?" Lilith looked at him with serious eyes, and at Xietan's disbelieving gaze she repeated, "An insignificant existence, as you called yourself before, should not be able to draw the attention of the most powerful higher existences under the bastion called sky." Xietain sucked in a breath of cold air, and his eyes widened as he heard this. What do you mean by that?" His voice was low as if he feared someone would hear him, proof of how nervous and disbelieving he was. Lilith sighed and closed her eyes for several seconds to recapitulate everything that had happened a couple of days ago. Then, she opened her eyes again and began to narrate everything. Xietain listened to Lilith's story, a story that involved existences that were millions of light years away, compared to his current little self, but was surprisingly closely related and linked to him, something that normally should never happen. From the summoning by the Demon Lord to the appearance of the 8 leaders of the 8 main factions of higher existences, Lilith explained in quality detail how a large part of the most powerful armies of the universe met in the same place due to the magical fluctuation of the constellation of the Heavenly Wolf and the powerful glow that illuminated a large part of the nearest stars and worlds. Xietain was greatly surprised to hear that while he and Shangyun Bingshu were dealing with the Asura race, the higher existences were engaged in a battle against the ghost of a legendary existence that had disappeared from the universe many, many years ago. However, what shocked Xietain the most was to hear how the remnant ghost of the Heavenly Wolf was actually powerful enough to terrify each and every one of the most powerful existences in existence. Just the remnant power left behind by an existence that had disappeared countless millions of years ago actually overwhelmed an 8th order existence completely, while over 1 million higher existences watched from a distance without daring to intervene at all. If not for the power of a mighty firmament fragment granting him a second chance, that mighty 8th order dragon would have become history days ago. But just as the ghost of the Heavenly Wolf was about to deliver the final blow, it suddenly stopped to look towards a certain specific point, and without warning, crushed its own spatial lock, which allowed the Dragon King to open a rift in space and successfully flee. However, the strangest part was when the ghost actually threw its precious spear in a hurry, as if it was afraid of being late for some special event. Lilith concluded the story by looking at the golden spear in Xietan's hands before adding, "The sole armament of the Heavenly Wolf Sirius was known in the past as annihilation of the falling sky. The spear you hold right now?" Xietain stood in a daze as he stared at a fixed point with his mind blurred. Everything he had just heard was too much for his mind to process. However, it was a story he needed to know, and it was precisely for this reason that Lilith had no choice but to tell it to him. After all, this story could help him find himself and could serve to clear up many mysteries, that the sooner they were cleared up the easier the future path of Xietain would be. Lilith noticed how Xietan's grip on annihilation of the falling sky tightened, clearly unwilling to let it go after hearing everything she told him. But this was completely normal. Annihilation of the falling sky could not only be the weapon of his past life, but was also a priceless treasure that countless would kill for. It was only natural for Xietain to treat it with greater care now that he knew its source. She remained silent and gave him time to assimilate all the information he had just acquired, which was no small amount. The two stood in silence, listening to the voices coming from outside the villa, and occasionally hearing military vehicles patrolling the residential area. It was only after about 15 minutes had passed that Xietain finally sighed, and with his free hand tousled his hair fiercely as he let out a low cry, "Dumb, this daddy here really got reincarnated?" The corner of Lilith's mouth twitched a couple of times as she said, "Well, that may not be the case. According to the leader of the demonic army, a person like the Heavenly Wolf Sirius could never be reincarnated, since his world was destroyed." "Oh?" Xietain raised his head and looked at her in surprise. Lilith decided that temporarily it was best not to tell Xietain about the higher existences not being able to see Earth, nor the fact that Earth seemed to be protected by some strange energy that she couldn't understand. He already had too much on his table to add more, so some matters were better reserved for later. Be that as it may, with blood manipulation, gravity manipulation, your past history with the constellation of the Heavenly Wolf, the strange move of Sirius's ghost saving you, and finally you being able to form an improvised contract without even doing anything with annihilation of the falling sky, I think it's safe to assume that, at the very least, you must be a perfect successor to the firmament fragment of the Heavenly Wolf, so much so that the ghost left behind by Sirius would not hesitate to put aside its anger for the sake of saving your life. Lilith sounded very confident in what she was saying, and Xietain found no reason or argument by which to reject her words. He plopped down on the bed, making his body bounce up and down, thanks to the springs of the mattress. After a few seconds, he smiled and pointed to himself as he said, "Damn, but who would have thought the blood manipulation and gravity manipulation could actually become so deadly in their most advanced stages? Even that 8th Order Dragon King was eating stardust under the attacks of Sirius's ghost. Blood chains capable of absorbing the enemy's mana and using their magical power to strengthen themselves, black holes capable of devouring all magical spells or deflecting all magic, as well as slowing down the enemy's movements." Xietain felt his soul tremble with excitement at what the future held for him. Lilith chuckled, and a glint of pride flashed in her beautiful ruby eyes. Any other normal person would definitely not be able to accept everything he had just heard from her. After all, the information he had received was no different from telling him with certainty that he was not what he thought he was, and that his 20 years of life had been a lie. However, even so, Xietain not only did not feel bad, but even seemed eager to try. But in fact, Lilith underestimated too much the effect her kiss had had on Xietain. The current him was not only not afraid of his possible identity, but also not afraid of what the future might have in store for him. To the current Xietain, as long as he could keep her by his side and ensure the safety of his family, everything else couldn't matter less. "All right?" Lilith snapped out of her dream world as a voice brimming with vigor rang out. She looked at Xietain with confused eyes, to which he responded with a big smile bursting with pride. "Lilith, your daddy, will show you what my pagoda can do. This daddy will definitely become the strongest faster than you ever expected." Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner and the Apocalypse. Chapter 569 Future Enemy Takes Over a Nuclear Base. Chapter 569 Future Enemy Takes Over a Nuclear Base. Without alerting anyone, Xietain activated his invisibility skill and easily managed to evade the patrols of armed forces and soul evolvers that hovered around the residential area where the core members of the faction lived together with those who had managed to earn a comfortable living by collaborating in a variety of ways with the faction in general. The stronger ones only felt a light breeze of wind pass beyond them, but none of them gave it a second thought, nor did they ponder too much on what happened. With the unnatural winds constantly changing their directions, and with gusts that in a moment were blowing at 10 kilometers per hour but in the next minute could go up to 80 kilometers per hour, it was nothing unusual for such things to happen. Xietain watched all this with a frown on his face as he disappeared beyond the walls and watchtowers of the base. "Looks like I'll have to find some method to increase the security of the privileged areas, or else an assassin like Soul Evolver could easily bring on a disaster." Xietain thought aloud as he exploded with over 600 agility points, disappearing from his previous position as if he had teleported and appearing over 300 meters away. As Xietain kept the same constant speed and charged into the distance in search of some distant village, Lilith appeared floating a few meters away above the sky and reminded him, "Little brother, even though your soldiers are not as powerful as you are, they are not as weak as you think. The main problem is that you are comparing them to you. It's the most normal thing in the world that they don't notice you if you don't want to be noticed. On the contrary, you would have to worry about your ability, if with all that pure soul power, and with those skills you have you are discovered by them." The reason why Xietain had left without drawing anyone's attention and without telling anyone was because he temporarily wanted to keep the matter of the pagoda a secret, as this was possibly his most important asset, even more than his own strength from a certain point of view. Only a handful of people had his trust enough to show them the power of the small wooden pagoda, and thus he temporarily preferred to keep it in the dark until a better opportunity came along. While Xietain had confidence in his strength, it was not blind confidence. Even if a normal bullet could not kill him, he knew well that a cannonball could really hurt him badly if it hit him, because although his external body would definitely come out unscathed, his internal organs were another matter. Therefore, better safe than sorry, the power of the small wooden pagoda was definitely enough to make even the most devoted grow greedy. "I guess you're right," Xietain nodded, and a moment later sighed, "If only I had first-hand technology in my hands, everything would be easier. The only things we've managed to acquire were a couple of night vision cameras and even fewer with infrared vision." If I got my hands on X-rays or motion sensors, even the strongest killer-type soul evolver on Earth at present would not be able to elude the detection of such devices, unless it possesses a skill that allows it to confuse technological devices. Well, what did you expect? Lilith chuckled and pointed out, in this district surrounded by forests and relatively low population, you were lucky to find a military camp. Moreover, your luck was colossal for having that girl with the surname Wu to show you the way, or else your path would definitely have been a lot more challenging than it was. That's true. Once Xietain and the rest of his troops began to move further into China, more towards the center of Beijing, and not as far into the periphery as they were now, the number of military bases would increase, and at the same time the quality of weaponry and technology would also improve. With Wu Yijin by their side, many things would be easier. I only hope Wu Yijin manages to convince her family to surrender if they are still alive, otherwise, I'm afraid it will be hard. Xietain frowned sharply as he thought of something he had previously been delaying, but now that the road to the south was open and clear needed to be considered. Lilith's thoughtful voice reached him from above. Xietain did not interrupt her and instead kept running, only stopping when he found traces of roads or human civilization. At this point, it was not an easy task to find a village that had not been already explored by his troops. After all, even those villages or minor towns that were relatively far for normal human troops to venture into had already been explored and turned upside down by the soul evolvers of his faction. Not to mention that there were other humans and soul evolvers on the loose as well. They also took advantage of the opportunities that came their way, so Xietain would not be so arrogant as to assume that everything had been taken over by him. In fact, there were more than a few times when his men returned empty-handed to report that the scouted site had already been looted by someone else. At that moment, Lilith's voice rang out again. Even if Wu Yijin fails at convincing her family, she will definitely be on your side. This will be so even if her heart breaks in pain, so you don't need to worry about this. The problem will be in how you deal with her family. You can't assume that a family that has been in power for so long will give up so easily, can you? The Wu family had been ruling over China and creating rules for many generations. Even if the world had changed and the rules created collapsed, it would not be at all easy to make them obey someone else's reign and rules. It was the same as trying to make someone who was a millionaire all their life live in a dusty wooden hut full of bugs, as difficult as climbing to the heavens. How are you so sure Wu Yijin will be on my side regardless of her family's choice? We are talking about those who raised her and gave her love all her life. I don't think her infatuation for me is worth that much. Xietain reasoned aloud. In his eyes, family should definitely be placed first when it came to a crush that hadn't existed until a month or two ago. Father, mother, siblings, grandparents, etc., those who had been there forever would definitely have to take precedence when it came to someone who was practically a stranger. However, that thought was Xietan's biggest mistake in these cases. Rascal, that stone-hard skill really doesn't let you see things in depth. Lilith sighed and said softly, little brother, when a maiden falls in love for the first time, she will usually find herself willing to do anything to gain her crush's approval. However, this is especially so for that Wu Yijin girl. In fact, if I'm honest with you, it may be that the feelings of that girl for you are so strong that even I can't comprehend them. You, who is under the constant passive effect of a powerful third-order skill, will naturally see your family higher than a recent love. But for Wu Yijin, who believed that she would never fall in love in her entire life and only waited to follow her family's arrangements, your existence became not too different from the ferryman who guides lost souls. Xietan's eyes flashed with complex light as he continued to zigzag through the giant trees that occasionally appeared in his path. Wu Yijin was without a doubt an amazing woman. In fact, if it came to affection, she was possibly the girl who appreciated him the most at present. Not only was she strikingly beautiful with a charming face and seductive body, but she was also caring, kind, talented, intelligent, hardworking, companionable, self-centered, mature, etc. She was, without a doubt, a practically perfect woman that the past Xietain could only dream to marry with. Such a woman had been the dream woman of countless talented young men to whom the Xietain of 2.5 months ago could not even compare in terms of appearance or family background. However, regardless of the means used or honeyed words she heard, Wu Yijin's heart always remained firm as an immovable mountain. Such a type of woman was not something a realistic Xietain would even dare to think of as his possible match. The two lived in different worlds and played in opposite leagues. But mysteries are always present, and the impossible sometimes becomes reality. Unfortunately, mind and reason could not make decisions or interfere when it came to matters of the heart. If such a thing were possible, Bai Zemin would perhaps take a chance and start a relationship with Wu Yijin, since logically, she was possibly the woman least likely to betray or hurt him. Even Lilith herself had admitted this point. Forget it. Let fate take its course. Bai Zemin refused to continue thinking about this matter temporarily. He had done what could be done and had even advised Wu Yijin to give up once. More than that was not possible. But Wu Yijin was right about something she had said to Bai Zemin before, and that was that fate and future were unknown. Who knows? Maybe, as hard to believe as it sounded to Bai Zemin, Wu Yijin's efforts would pay off, and she managed to get into his heart. It could be tomorrow, it could be a month from now, a year from now, 10 years from now, or maybe never. Only the future and destiny knew the answer. Now, the biggest problem was what he would do once his faction and the family of Wu Yijin met face to face. Bai Zemin was aware that his goal of wanting to turn all of China into a dynasty, where his rule would become absolute rule, would definitely touch the nerves of the old government, and in contrast to Wu Yijin, he was not particularly optimistic about the possible outcome of a conversation between the two parties. Even if he exhibited overwhelming power, it might not be enough. Lilith, can you tell me where the country's nuclear or satellite bases are? It should be easy for you with your power, right? Bai Zemin suddenly thought of an idea and quickly asked the question at hand. However, Lilith shook her head and said in a clear voice, "You little scoundrel, I already told you. I can't interfere directly with those things. Giving you information that will sooner or later be discovered by you is not a problem, but even then I'm already playing with my luck, and a single mistake will cause the soul record to dismiss me. But giving you information about nuclear and satellite bases would be no different than a higher existence giving to a lower existence a divine sword, considering that a 500 megaton nuclear bomb has the power to wipe out the life of a fourth-order existence." Before Bai Zemin expressed regret, Lilith emphasized, "Any kind of information that interferes with your future interaction with humans too much is forbidden. If you want to find something, you'll have to do it yourself, or else nothing would make sense." What a pity! Bai Zemin sighed and shook his head in disappointment. Now that he could charge south without any problems, if Lilith would give him the information about satellite and military bases, then Bai Zemin could go take control of such locations around Beijing, once he found his loved ones, and secured their well-being. Unfortunately but understandably, things were not as easy as they could have been. Even then, Bai Zemin quickly shook off that feeling of disappointment. Lilith had already done so much for him and was helping him too much. Even now, he could not afford the luxury and daring to be disappointed by the fact that the rules binding her did not allow her to bestow him with a divine sword as she had exemplified. Just as Bai Zemin was racking his brain thinking about what to do with Wu Yijin's family, Lilith's voice sounded again just above his head. "While I can't give you the location of any nuclear, satellite, or military bases, I can give you some information that is definitely of interest to you." "Oh? And what would that be?" he replied without much interest. However, Lilith's next words chilled his blood. "One of your future enemies has actually taken control over a nuclear weapons base. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner and the Apocalypse. Chapter 570 Great Ruler. Chapter 570 Great Ruler. One of your possible future enemies captured a nuclear bomb base not too long ago." Lilith's words were like a thunderclap striking just above Bai Zemin's house at the moment he was preparing to leave for a couple of days' vacation at the beach in the middle of the summer season. He felt his blood run cold and begin to stagnate like water in a freezer, waiting for total freezing. His whole body shivered for an instant before he could regain his composure. A nuclear bomb base? Forget about the current Bai Zemin. Even if he was twice as powerful compared to his current self, a single nuclear bomb was more than enough to send him to the afterlife at least 1,000 times. Even if Bai Zemin somehow managed to survive, which was totally impossible, the radiation would cause him injuries that would probably take years to heal from, and could even cause strange mutations, deforming him completely. What do you mean?" he asked in a stiff voice. Lilith noticed by how his voice wavered at the beginning of the question that Bai Zemin was very tense, but she couldn't blame him. Humanity's nuclear weapons were undoubtedly deadly weapons that few lower existences could do anything against. When it came to technology, Lilith knew other races that surpassed Earth's current technology by far. But when it came to destructive power, there were few races that possessed a weapon of mass destruction like those of humanity. This nuclear bomb base I'm telling you about had fallen when the apocalypse broke out. 80% of the troops stationed there turned into zombies, and more than half of the personnel trained to operate the computers also failed to adapt to the mana so naturally, they mutated as well. Lilith began to explain the past situation in order for Xietain to understand the present better. The operators managed to kill all the zombies inside the control room, thanks to the fact that as humans, they still maintain their intelligence, unlike the initial zombies who only move by instinct towards the nearest target. These operators stayed locked in there and barely survived by eating bag relief food specially prepared for emergencies, similar to what many astronauts eat. But 2 days ago, someone arrived at the nuclear bomb base with a large army. A large army? Xietain seemed to think of something, so he hurriedly asked, Lilith, this large army you speak of is composed of military men? Lilith nodded and said in a serious voice, the leader of this army is also not lacking of soul evolvers. In fact, this person is a soul evolver and a considerably powerful one at that. Although not on the level of Shangyun Bingshu, probably only someone on the level of that Russian girl named Evangeline could do something about it. Maybe and just maybe, Chen He with his most powerful attack could also do something against this person. Xietain remained silent for a long time, thinking carefully about the information Lilith had just given him. If the other side only had an armed army, then he didn't have to fear anything. Xietain was confident that his Blood Spear Legion alone was more than enough to wipe out an army of several tens of thousands, regardless of the losses. However, when soul evolvers were added to the mix in large numbers, things were very different. The skills that an existence could obtain by defeating enemies were powerful, and many of them were skills with strange characteristics, so much so that even Xietain himself had to be careful. Therefore, it was best not to take an enemy capable of erecting such a powerful faction in such a short time as a light matter. However, Xietain was fast to identify the possible identity of this person, even without having seen him. It must be an important member of the Wu family, or it could even be Bingshu's father. He thought aloud. Without a doubt. Lilith nodded and pointed out, the nuclear bomb base operators and soldiers would definitely not open the gates to the facility to just anyone, unless a few more months passed, forcing them into total despair. This person must have a high rank within China's governmental or military power to be able to enter smoothly and take control of the site after its troops eliminated the threats around and inside. Xietain closed his eyes and began to do some calculations in his mind. After about 2 or 3 minutes, he opened his eyes again, but this time his look was serious instead of a slightly panicked look. Oh? Lilith looked at him in surprise and asked, did you find out something? I can't feel panic coming from you anymore, which while it's good, now I feel curious. Would you mind telling me what caused that change in you? Xietain started walking towards the village that had appeared in his range of vision and slowly said, while a nuclear bomb can kill me, this only applies if the bomb detonates in a place too close from me. Just now I just simulated different scenarios and managed to discover 2 ways in which the power of a nuclear bomb can be completely suppressed or decrease its threat by between 50% and 70%. So, the way to decrease the threat would be to cause the nuclear missile to explode before it reaches the place where you are, Lilith said aloud, earning a nod from Xietain. But even if you manage to do that, the radiation will spread quickly, so you'll be forced to mobilize all your people far away, and even then it's unlikely you won't suffer losses. Indeed. Xietain said in a serious voice and pointed out, not to mention that if any of China's intercontinental or hypersonic missiles are located in that nuclear bomb base, then the idea of hitting the missile from a distance may well disappear. The speed of the intercontinental and hypersonic missiles was simply too much for Xietain to do anything about, especially the hypersonic missiles. If one of these were launched, then he might as well start saying goodbye to his life from now on. What about the other method you speak of? Lilith asked with a frown. The other method depends. Xietain sighed and ruffled his hair as he said, if the other party were to attack me with a normal nuclear missile, then maybe I could do something using gravity manipulation and blood manipulation, along with shadow blink. But then again, if what the other party uses is a hypersonic or intercontinental missile, all I can do is use the power of the tidal irregular to flee to another world. At the end of the day, Xietain was still too weak to call himself unstoppable and invincible under the heavens. He clenched his fist tightly secretly as a burning flame of desire began to blaze in his midnight black eyes. Stronger? Stronger? It still wasn't enough. Even after all he had battled, even though he had been on the brink of death so many times, and even though he had suffered such great injuries, he was still as small as an ant. Xietain felt useless for not even being able to do anything against humanity's strongest weapon created before evolution. At the thought of fleeing to avoid death, Xietan's stomach churned and the urge to vomit due to disgust flooded him for an instant. He, who had never taken a step back in a battle to the death, was actually thinking of running away to save his life. So pathetic, he whispered under his breath as he gritted his teeth. Lilith watched his back as she walked behind him, but said nothing at his whisper. Xietain had managed to emerge victorious in every battlefield he stepped on. Even powerful Fourth Order warriors failed to end his life, and on the contrary, one of them was wounded by his blows, while another was killed partly thanks to him. Therefore, Lilith understood how he was feeling right now, since in the past she went through something similar. In fact, every powerful warrior and all the brilliant talents experienced what Xietain was experiencing now. Besides, this probably wouldn't be the only time you would feel like this. Xietain, can I ask you a favor? Lilith said suddenly, causing him to pause to look back. Xietan's eyes widened slightly as he saw the soft gaze Lilith was looking at him with, and without waiting for a response from him, she continued, I just want to ask you that if at any time you feel that all sense was lost, if at any moment you feel that your only purpose in this life is revenge, please remember that you are never alone. I will always be there to support you, she said with a smile that teetered between bittersweet and bitter. Xietain was silent for a moment before quietly asking, why are you saying that all of a sudden? However, Lilith did not answer him and instead shook her head. No matter how much Xietain tried, she said no more. Xietain decided to leave the matter for later, but he kept Lilith's words in his heart because so far, there was no word she had said just for the sake of saying. On the other hand, he began to think about what to do with the Wu family to which Wu Yijin belonged, as well as this possible future enemy that he had not yet faced, but would probably have to face sooner or later. There were many things that Xietain had to do and many more things that needed to be planned very carefully. A single mistake, a misstep, and everything would fall apart in a matter of seconds. It was difficult to build a great skyscraper, but you would be surprised how easy it would be to bring it to the ground. An instant was all that was needed. On the other hand, Lilith continued to look at Xietan's back with tenderness, anger, hatred, fear, and many emotions that were hard to explain, which made her mood not the best. But in fact, these emotions were not directed at Xietain himself, but at something inside his soul, the rune of the unique skill Blood Berserker's Wrath. Although the name was different and probably the power granted to the user was different as well, Lilith knew a person with a skill that possessed side effects practically identical to the Blood Berserker's Wrath skill that Xietain possessed. This skill was so powerful that it honestly shouldn't exist. However, as strong as it was, this skill was also deadly for the user, and worst of all, the user could do nothing to avoid the miserable fate that awaited it and all those around him. Lilith could only silently plead and pray to the fate that the worst would never happen. Otherwise, far from achieving her goal, she might end up losing the existence that currently meant the most to her. We are here. Xietan's voice brought her out of her inner thoughts, and as she looked ahead, she noticed that at some point they had entered the abandoned village. Xietain and Lilith walked silently through the mostly dirt streets surrounding the village, and found bloodstains and gnawed bones littering the ground. Most of the doors of the houses had been opened or simply broken down, and a single glance to the inside was more than enough for anyone to understand that misery had struck those who formerly lived there. Don't tell me this place was also looted? Xietain growled. He had gone far away from all his bases, past and current, all for the sake of finding a village that hadn't been looted, or else he probably wouldn't be able to use the power of his pagoda. Just then, the sound of footsteps from the distance came within Xietan's detection range, causing his eyes to sparkle with joy. He rushed forward in a hurry, and seeing his enthusiasm, even Lilith couldn't help but feel a little excited as the desire to know the power of the small wooden pagoda grew within her. Lilith, can you see that zombie? Xietain asked with a smile, and it seemed as if all his worries had disappeared as the mutant creature began to growl and run in his direction at a speed no slower than a normal human before the apocalypse. With the constant evolution, the zombies were not only growing in terms of levels, but the extremely low agility was also starting to grow. Soon, they would become humanity's greatest danger. Lilith looked at him in confusion, but when she saw Xietain take out the small wooden pagoda from his storage ring, a thought that left her in shock struck her mind. Now I would show you another reason why only I can rule over mankind. Only I, who possesses the treasure to save mankind, can be the great and only ruler.